You know, there's something almost sacred about those quiet moments when you think you're building something real with another person. I remember it started on a Tuesday evening in October, right after our shift ended at Peterson's hardware store on Main Street. The autumn rain was coming down hard, turning the parking lot into a mirror of streetlights and neon signs from the diner across the road. That's when I first offered Jake a ride home. I had been working at Peterson's for almost 3 years by then, stocking shelves, helping customers find the right screws for their weekend projects, and learning every inch of that old store like it was my second home. Jake had started just 2 months earlier, fresh out of college with that eager energy that reminded me of myself when I first walked through those glass doors. He was struggling to adjust to the rhythm of retail work, often staying late to finish his tasks while I watched him from the corner of my eye, recognizing that same determination I once had. The trust between us began to grow in those car rides home. Every evening, as we drove through the familiar streets of our small town, past the old church with its broken steeple and the abandoned gas station that had been closing soon for the past 5 years, Jake would open up about his fears and dreams. He told me about his student loans, his girlfriend back in college who had broken up with him over the phone, and how he sometimes felt lost in this new chapter of his life. I found myself genuinely caring about his struggles, offering advice when he asked for it, and simply listening when that's what he needed most. What struck me most was how grateful he seemed for these simple acts of kindness. In a world where everyone seemed too busy to notice each other's pain, here was someone who appreciated being seen, being heard, being valued. Those 20-minute drives became the highlight of my day, a time when I felt like I was making a real difference in someone's life. The confidence I gained from being his trusted confidant was intoxicating, filling a void I hadn't even realized existed in my own professional relationships. The routine became as natural as breathing. Every day at 5:30 I would find Jake by the employee entrance, sometimes still in his work apron, always with that smile that said, "Thank you," before his lips could form the words. We would walk to my old Honda together, and I would feel this warm sense of purpose washing over me. Here was someone who needed me, who valued my presence, who made me feel important in ways my job never could. The loyalty I felt toward him grew stronger with each passing day, rooted in what I believed was mutual respect and genuine friendship. But friendship, I've learned, is like trust. It requires 2 people to build it, but only one to destroy it. As we drove through those familiar streets night after night, I began to notice small things that should have warned me about the disappointment that was coming. Sometimes Jake would get text messages that made him smile in ways he never smiled at my stories. Sometimes he would mention people from work I had never heard him talk to during our shifts. Sometimes his gratitude felt rehearsed, like lines from a play he had performed too many times before. Still, I chose to focus on the moments that felt real, the conversations that seemed genuine, the laughter that filled my car and made me believe I had found something precious in the mundane landscape of retail work. Looking back now, I realize I was so hungry for connection, so eager to feel valued, that I ignored the signs that were right there in front of me. But perhaps that's exactly what Jake was counting on. My willingness to give more than I received, my need to be needed, my desire to believe that small acts of kindness could build bridges that would last. Little did I know, I was about to learn a lesson about the difference between being appreciated and being used, a lesson that would change how I viewed every relationship that followed. It was during one of those November evenings, as we sat in traffic outside Miller's supermarket waiting for the light to change, that the idea first came to me. Jake had been talking about how isolated he felt at work, how the other employees seemed to have their own little groups and inside jokes that he wasn't part of. I watched his reflection in the passenger window, saw the loneliness etched in the lines around his eyes, and something in my chest tightened with the familiar urge to fix things, to make them better. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my small apartment above the old laundromat on Oak Street, the plan began to fall in my mind. A dinner party, something warm and welcoming that would bring our whole team together. I imagined us all sitting around my grandmother's old dining table, The one piece of furniture I had inherited that actually meant something to me. Sharing stories and laughter over homemade food. It would be my way of creating the sense of belonging that Jake craved. The professional environment where everyone felt valued and included. The next morning, I could barely contain my excitement as I shared the idea with him during our usual coffee break. We were standing by the employee bulletin board, sipping burnt coffee from styrofoam cups, when I mentioned my plan. His face lit up in a way I had rarely seen before. Genuine enthusiasm that made me believe I had finally found the perfect way to show him how much our friendship meant to me. He immediately started suggesting menu items, asking if I needed help with decorations, offering to bring dessert. The confidence in his voice, the way he took ownership of the idea alongside me, made me feel like we were truly partners in this endeavor. Over the next 2 weeks, planning that dinner became my obsession. I spent my lunch breaks at the grocery store, carefully selecting ingredients for dishes that would accommodate everyone's dietary preferences. I remembered that Sarah from the paint department was vegetarian. That old Mr. Peterson had mentioned his wife was diabetic. That Jake had casually mentioned loving his grandmother's apple pie during one of our drives home. Every detail mattered because every person mattered, and I wanted this evening to be perfect for all of them. The preparation filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. In my small kitchen, surrounded by recipe books borrowed from the library and ingredients spread across every available surface, I felt like I was crafting something meaningful. This wasn't just about food. It was about connection, about showing my colleagues that someone cared enough to bring them together. The loyalty I felt toward Jake extended naturally to everyone else, because I believed that creating this space for him would demonstrate the kind of friendship I thought we had built. But it was during the final week of planning that Jake dropped the news that should have been my first warning. We were driving past the old Texaco station, the one with the faded sign that flickered on and off like a dying heartbeat, when he casually mentioned that he might bring someone. "Just a friend from work," he said, his tone deliberately casual in the way people use when they're hiding something important. "You wouldn't mind, would you? She's been having a tough time lately, and I thought this might cheer her up." The way he said "she" made something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was about inclusion, about making everyone feel welcome, about the professional environment I was trying to create. Of course I didn't mind. Of course he could bring a friend. Of course this was exactly the kind of gesture that proved what a good person he was, thinking of others who needed support. But as we pulled into his driveway, and I watched him walk toward his front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted between us, though I couldn't yet name what it was. The excitement I felt about the dinner remained, but now it carried with it the first whisper of uncertainty, the first shadow of what was coming. The evening of the dinner arrived with one of those perfect December nights where the air is crisp enough to see your breath, but not so cold that you want to rush indoors. I had spent the entire day preparing, transforming my modest apartment into what I hoped would feel like a warm refuge from the harsh realities of retail work. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs filled every corner of my space, mixing with the vanilla candles I had lit on the dining table. Everything was perfect, or at least as perfect as I could make it on a hardware store employee's salary. I had positioned myself strategically near the window that overlooked the street, watching for the familiar headlights of my colleagues' cars. Sarah arrived first, bringing a bottle of wine she probably couldn't afford, and that genuine smile that had made her one of the few people at work I actually looked forward to seeing. Mr. Peterson came next, moving slowly up the stairs with a container of his wife's famous cookies, the ones she only made for special occasions. Each arrival filled me with increasing confidence that this evening would be exactly what I had envisioned, a moment where our little work, family could become something more meaningful. But when Jake's car pulled up to the curb, something in my chest tightened. Through the windshield I could see two silhouettes instead of one. The passenger door opened first, and out stepped someone I recognized but had never really paid attention to. Rachel from the garden center, a woman who had started working at Peterson's just a few weeks after Jake. She moved with a familiarity around him that made my stomach drop, the kind of easy intimacy that develops between people who share secrets, inside jokes, private moments that the rest of us aren't privy to. They walked up to my building together, and I watched from my window as Jake held the door open for her, his hand briefly touching the small of her back in a gesture so natural it could only come from practice. The confidence I had built up throughout the day began to crumble as I realized this wasn't just a colleague being kind to someone having a tough time. This was something else entirely, something that made all those evening car rides and shared confidences feel suddenly naive and one-sided. When I opened my apartment door to greet them, Rachel immediately stepped forward with the kind of enthusiasm that would have been endearing under different circumstances. "This place smells incredible," she exclaimed, brushing past me to survey the table I had spent hours arranging. "Jake told me you were an amazing cook, but this is beyond what I imagined." The way she said his name, with that casual intimacy, made it clear that they had been talking about me, about tonight, about things I wasn't part of. As the evening progressed, I found myself becoming an observer in my own home. Jake and Rachel had positioned themselves at what I had intended to be the head of the table, the seats I had mentally reserved for Jake and myself as the hosts of this gathering. They shared glances across plates of food I had prepared with them in mind, laughed at references I didn't understand, and spoke in the shorthand that develops between people who spend more time together than anyone realizes. The professional environment I had tried to create suddenly felt like a stage where I was playing the wrong part. The most painful moment came during dessert, when Rachel began telling a story about something that had happened at work the previous week. It was a story that involved Jake, that painted them both as the heroes of a minor workplace drama I knew nothing about. As she spoke, gesturing with her fork and making everyone laugh, I realized that while I had been focused on those 20-minute car rides home, Jake had been building an entirely different relationship with someone else. The trust I thought we had established, the loyalty I believed was mutual, the friendship I had invested so much emotional energy in, all of it had been happening in my imagination, while the real connection was growing somewhere else entirely. The disappointment that washed over me in that moment was so profound that I had to excuse myself to the kitchen, where I stood gripping the edge of the sink and trying to make sense of how completely I had misread the situation. The Monday morning after the dinner party arrived grey and cold, matching the hollow feeling that had settled in my chest sometime between cleaning up the dishes and lying awake at 3 a.m, replaying every moment of the evening. I walked into Peterson's hardware store with the same routine I had followed for 3 years, but everything felt different now. The familiar smell of sawdust and metal polish, the sound of the bell above the front door, even the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. It all seemed muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on my entire world. Jake was already at his station when I arrived, arranging boxes of screws with the same methodical precision he had shown since his first week. But when I walked past him toward the supply closet, something that would have been impossible just days earlier happened. He didn't look up. Not a nod, not a smile, not even the basic acknowledgement you give to a stranger on the street. The confidence I had felt in our friendship, built over months of shared conversations and what I thought were meaningful moments, evaporated in the face of his calculated indifference. Throughout that first day, I found myself studying Jake's behavior with the desperate attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit together. During our usual morning coffee break, he chose to sit with Rachel at a table across the room, their heads bent together in conversation that occasionally erupted into laughter. When customers asked questions that would normally have brought us together to help solve their problems, he would redirect them to other employees or handle the situations himself. The professional environment that had once felt collaborative now felt divided into territories I was no longer welcome to cross. Rachel, for her part, had transformed overnight from a quiet colleague I barely knew into someone who moved through the store with the easy familiarity of ownership. She began arriving early and staying late, often timing her schedule to match Jake's in ways that made their partnership visible to everyone. During lunch breaks, I would watch from my usual spot near the break room window as they walked together to the deli across the street, sharing sandwiches and secrets in the same spot where Jake and I had sometimes grabbed quick meals during busy weeks. The loyalty I had once felt from him was now being directed elsewhere, and I was forced to witness its absence in every interaction. The silence between Jake and me became a living thing, growing heavier with each passing day. In the narrow aisles of the hardware store, we developed an elaborate dance of avoidance. He would turn down one row as I entered another. He would finish his tasks in the stockroom just as I was assigned to work there. He would time his breaks to avoid any possibility of us being alone together. The trust that had once made those evening car rides feel natural and necessary was replaced by an awkwardness so thick you could cut it with one of the utility knives we sold in aisle 3. But perhaps the most devastating part was how everyone else seemed to understand what had happened before I did. Sarah began giving me those sympathetic looks that people reserve for situations too delicate to address directly. Mr. Peterson, with the wisdom of someone who had managed employees for 40 years, started assigning Jake and me to different sections of the store without explanation. Even the regular customers seemed to sense the shift, occasionally asking where that nice young man who usually helps you had gone when they saw me working alone. By the end of that week, the reality of the situation had crystallized into something I could no longer deny. The person I had thought was my friend, the colleague I had invested months of emotional energy in supporting, had used my kindness as a convenience rather than valuing it as a connection. Every car ride home had been just that, transportation. Every shared confidence had been one-sided. Every moment I had treasured as friendship had been, from his perspective, simply a transaction. The disappointment I felt wasn't just about losing a friend. It was about discovering that the friend had never existed in the first place. And perhaps most painful of all was the growing realization that everyone else had probably seen this coming long before I did, which left me questioning not just Jake's intentions, but my own ability to read people and situations accurately. The professional environment I had worked so hard to improve had become a daily reminder of my own naivety, and I began to wonder if the silence that surrounded me now was actually the sound of truth I had been too hopeful to hear before. The weeks that followed the dinner party became a masterclass in self-doubt, the kind that creeps into your bones and makes you question every decision you've ever made. I found myself replaying conversations from months past, searching for clues I had missed, signs I should have recognized, moments when Jake's true intentions might have been clearer if I hadn't been so invested in believing the story I wanted to be true. Those long drives home from work, which had once been filled with podcasts or music, now became silent journeys through a landscape of regret and second-guessing. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the way it made me question my own judgment about everything else in my life. If I could so completely misread Jake's intentions, what else was I wrong about? Was Sarah's friendship genuine, or was she just being polite to a colleague she felt sorry for? Did Mr. Peterson value my work, or was he simply too kind to tell me I was replaceable? The confidence I had built over 3 years of steady employment and what I thought were solid relationships began to crumble like a house built on sand, leaving me feeling vulnerable in ways I hadn't experienced since my first day on the job. I started avoiding the break room during lunch, choosing instead to eat my sandwich in my car, while parked behind the hardware store, next to the dumpster where the loading trucks made their deliveries. From there, I could see Jake and Rachel through the back windows, laughing over their meals, their heads bent together in the same intimate way I had once imagined he and I shared during our evening drives. The loyalty I had felt toward him, which had seemed so pure and uncomplicated just weeks before, now felt foolish and naive, like the emotional equivalent of a child's drawing proudly displayed on a refrigerator, well-intentioned but ultimately amateur. The trust I had lost wasn't just in Jake. It was in my own ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of any workplace. I began second-guessing every interaction, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings or ulterior motives. When customers complimented my knowledge of plumbing supplies, or thank me for helping them find the right tool for their projects. I found myself wondering if they were just being polite. When Mr. Peterson asked me to handle the inventory for the upcoming spring season, I questioned whether it was recognition of my competence, or simply the assignment of tedious work to someone he considered expendable. The frustration of it all was compounded by the fact that life at Peterson's Hardware continued as if nothing had changed. The same customers came in looking for the same solutions to their weekend projects. The same deliveries arrived on Tuesday and Friday mornings. The same seasonal displays needed to be assembled and dismantled according to the same predictable schedule. But I moved through this familiar routine feeling like an actor who had forgotten her lines, going through the motions while internally struggling to understand how the script had changed so dramatically without anyone bothering to give me the updated version. Sleep became elusive during this period, replaced by 3 a.m. sessions of mental archaeology, where I would excavate every memory for evidence of my own stupidity. Had Jake ever actually asked for my advice? Or had I simply offered it because I needed to feel useful? Had those conversations in my car been meaningful to him? Or had he just been making polite noise while waiting for his free ride to end? Had I created an entire friendship in my imagination while he was simply tolerating my presence until something better came along? The questions multiplied like weeds, choking out any possibility of peace or clarity. The most devastating realization came during one of those sleepless nights, as I lay staring at the ceiling of my apartment and listening to the sounds of the laundromat below, cycling through its endless wash and rinse patterns. I finally understood that the person I had been mourning, the friend I thought I had lost, the colleague I believed had valued my support, had never actually existed. I had projected my own need for connection onto someone who was simply accepting whatever convenience I offered. The disappointment I felt wasn't really about Jake's betrayal. It was about my own willingness to create meaning where none existed, to build castles in the air, and then feel crushed when gravity inevitably brought them down. And perhaps most painfully, I realized that this pattern might not be unique to my relationship with Jake, that I might have been doing this my entire life, mistaking politeness for friendship, convenience for connection, and my own emotional investment for mutual caring. The thought that I might have to re-examine every relationship I valued through this new lens of suspicion and doubt made the betrayal feel less like a single event and more like the beginning of a much larger and more frightening journey of self-discovery. It was during a particularly grey February morning, while I was restocking the paint section and mechanically arranging cans of primer in neat rows, that Sarah approached me with the kind of careful directness that had become rare in my professional environment. She had been watching me for weeks, she said, and couldn't stand to see me withdraw from everyone and everything that had once brought me joy at work. Her words cut through the fog of self-doubt I had been living in, not because they offered easy answers, but because they reminded me that at least one person had been paying attention to my pain. That conversation became the first crack in the wall I had built around myself since the dinner party disaster. Sarah didn't try to minimize what had happened or offer platitudes about Jake not being worth my friendship. Instead, she shared her own story about a previous job where she had invested months trying to help a colleague, who ultimately took credit for her work and got promoted while she remained stuck in the same position. Her honesty about her own disappointment and the lessons she had learned helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't unique to me, or evidence of some fundamental flaw in my character. Over the following weeks, Sarah and I began taking our lunch breaks together, sometimes walking to the small park behind the Presbyterian church, where we could sit on the old wooden benches and talk without the background noise of the hardware store. These conversations became a lifeline for me, a way to process what had happened without the constant self-recrimination that had been eating away at my confidence. She helped me see that my willingness to support Jake hadn't been foolish, it had been generous. The problem wasn't with my character, it was with his. The professional environment at Peterson's began to feel less hostile as I started to rebuild my sense of worth from the inside out. Instead of avoiding the break room, I began sitting with Sarah and occasionally joining conversations with other colleagues I had previously overlooked. I discovered that Tom from the electrical department had a dry sense of humor that could make even the most mundane inventory discussions entertaining, and that Maria from customer service had been dealing with her own challenges helping an ungrateful relative who never seemed to appreciate her sacrifices. As winter turned to spring, I found myself gradually reclaiming the parts of my personality that had made me effective and valued at work in the first place. My knowledge of the store's inventory, built over 3 years of careful attention to detail, became something I took pride in again rather than something I questioned. When customers asked for my help finding solutions to their home improvement challenges, I began to trust my own expertise instead of second-guessing every recommendation. The loyalty I had once directed toward Jake was slowly being redirected toward people who actually deserved it, including myself. The turning point came during a busy Saturday in April, when a customer brought in a complex plumbing problem that stumped both Jake and Rachel. Without thinking, I stepped in and suggested a solution that involved combining parts from 3 different manufacturers in a way that wasn't obvious, but would save the customer both time and money. The gratitude in the customer's eyes, the way Mr. Peterson nodded approvingly from across the store, and even the grudging acknowledgement from Jake, reminded me that my value as an employee and as a person wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. But perhaps the most important part of this rebuilding process was learning to forgive myself for the mistake of trusting too easily rather than focusing on the betrayal of being trusted too little. The disappointment I had felt about Jake's behavior was real and justified, but the shame I had carried about my own actions was not. I began to understand that the capacity to care deeply about others, to offer support without expecting immediate returns, and to believe the best about people's intentions weren't character flaws to be corrected. They were strengths to be protected and directed more carefully. The confidence I built during this period wasn't based on becoming harder or more cynical. It was based on becoming more discerning about who deserved the gift of my emotional investment. And for the first time since the dinner party, when I looked in the mirror each morning before work, I saw someone I respected looking back at me. The summer that followed brought with it a clarity that only comes from having survived something that fundamentally changes how you see the world. As I walked through the familiar aisles of Peterson's hardware store, past the paint cans I had organized countless times and the tool displays I could navigate blindfolded, I carried with me a hard-earned wisdom about the difference between being useful and being valued. The lesson wasn't that I should stop caring about my colleagues or that kindness is weakness. It was that true friendship requires reciprocity, and genuine professional relationships are built on mutual respect rather than one-sided dedication. The experience with Jake had taught me to pay attention to the subtle signs that reveal people's true intentions. I learned to notice the difference between someone who asks about your day because they care about the answer, and someone who asks because it's socially expected. I discovered that real friends remember the details of your struggles and celebrate your small victories, while people who are simply using your kindness tend to have remarkably selective memories about your contributions to their lives. The trust I now offered was still genuine, but it was no longer blind. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that my value as a person and as an employee wasn't determined by how much I could do for others, but by what I brought to the table through my own skills, knowledge, and character. The nights I had spent driving Jake home hadn't made me a better person. I had already been a good person who was generous with her time. The dinner party I had organized hadn't proven my worth. It had demonstrated a worth that already existed. The professional environment I had tried to create through acts of service was something I deserved to participate in, not something I needed to earn through constant giving. This new understanding changed how I approached every relationship, both at work and in my personal life. I became more selective about where I invested my emotional energy, but I didn't become cold or calculating. Instead, I learned to look for the signs of reciprocity. The colleague who remembered to ask about my sick mother, the friend who offered help before being asked, the people who showed up consistently, rather than only when they needed something. The loyalty I felt toward others became more conditional, but it also became more precious, because it was reserved for people who had earned it. The months that passed also revealed something unexpected about Jake and Rachel's relationship. By autumn, their intense connection had burned itself out in the dramatic fashion of relationships built more on convenience and mutual validation than on genuine compatibility. Jake had moved on to a job at a larger store across town, and Rachel had transferred to a different department where she rarely interacted with the rest of us. Their absence from my daily routine was a relief, but it also served as a reminder that some people drift through life, taking what they need from others without ever learning to give back. As winter approached and I marked nearly 4 years at Peterson's hardware store, I found myself in a position I had never expected, genuinely content with my professional environment and confident in my ability to navigate its social complexities. The disappointment that had once felt overwhelming had transformed into something more valuable: wisdom. I had learned that not everyone who smiles at you is your friend, that not everyone who accepts your help is grateful for it, and that some people view kindness as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. But perhaps the most profound lesson was this: the betrayal hadn't diminished my capacity for friendship or my willingness to support others. It had simply made me more strategic about how I shared those gifts. I still offered help to colleagues who were struggling, but I paid attention to whether that help was appreciated or taken for granted. I still invested in relationships, but I looked for evidence that the investment was mutual. I still believed in the possibility of genuine connection in professional settings, but I understood that such connections required 2 people who were equally committed to building something real. The confidence I carried now wasn't the naive optimism of someone who had never been hurt. It was the quiet strength of someone who had been hurt and learned to protect herself without becoming bitter. And every morning, as I unlocked the front door of Peterson's hardware store and prepared for another day of helping customers solve their problems, I carried with me the knowledge that I had survived one of life's most painful lessons and emerged not just intact, but actually stronger than before. Should I continue to topic 2, or would you like me to make any adjustments to this first topic?